Everybody knows you, I guess.
No, no.
So you didn't get in
I'm
that
here to
today.
talk to you. What to say? We met each other in the momentous days of the 2012 biennial that Richard took part in as one of the artists in that biennial. And we formed an immediate friendship. Am I okay now? In his studio in Los Angeles. And at that point, he was totally involved in the work of Hijikata, if I said it properly, and who was the founder of Buto dance in Japan. And I was a person who had never been to Japan and asked him a million questions because he had been involved with this amazing study, and I was interested in this person, Hijikata. So finally, we got around to maybe talking about your work. I think that was was what happened. But when it was suggested that I would be the moderator to talk about Rachel with Richard, I was very happy to do that because I knew we would have a chance to talk to each other.
And it made me more comfortable.
So. We have, over the last couple of days, been exchanging emails and thoughts, and today walked around the exhibition together. And so what you're going to hear is us sharing thoughts. Richard has written on Rachel's work. I've written on Rachel's work recently, and so we bring different points of view to this. But I think I really think the evening belongs to Richard, and I think that you will find some of his ideas kind of quite interesting. So I don't know whether you want to, how you want to start this with your original writing ideas maybe about Rachel and then move ahead, or up to you.
Did we decide when that Parquet issue was?
Not really.
Yeah, so there was an issue of Parquet that I wrote on Rachel, and it seemed like, I don't know, I'd done whatever, a tad amount of research. I thought it was, due diligence to read the things that had been written before, whether essays or, and I kept running across, I think Voyage of the Beagle was new, so that was what, 2007?
We have to refer everything to Carol. Yep, 2007.
Yeah. And it seemed like that piece in particular kind of made evident Rachel's relationship to figurative sculpture, but also the history of statues. So I really kind of wanted to do a kind of dumb categorical analysis of the history of statues and begin to characterize Rachel's work in terms of the standing figure, the reclining figure, the multi-group figure, and what's the last one? The bust. So by that, that's, I guess, where I kind of started. What was the point of that? I guess also in reading a number of things that I kept running across Duchamp, and I was like, well, which Duchamp? Because it seemed like the ready-made was just kind of, knee-jerk. You put objects on, consumer objects on things, and all of a sudden it's the ready-made. And I thought, well, it's like there's a use of mannequins in here. The surrealists had like a relationship to mannequins, particularly in the 1938 International Exposition de Surrealism in Paris. And what Duchamp had organized was a group of artists to take the same mannequins and alter them in some way. And the connection for me was that it was less about the ready-made and more about a kind of, what is it? It sort of, in the installation of that room, which was called Beautiful Streets of Paris, so that there was this kind of streetwalker allusion to it, and thus a kind of, surrealist confrontation of bourgeois values, and what's viewer worthy. But at the same time, it was a kind of sardonic or, you know, satirical view of something like a Hall of the Vestal Virgins or something. You know, a collection of, like you see in the where's the Pope live? The Vatican. You know, like these long halls of figurative statuary. And so that was where I ended up, I think. Yeah.
When you first wrote about her?
When I first, I mean, things have changed, I think, for Rachel since then. But I don't know, with that essay, I just kind of wanted to firm up that idea of this definitive history of statuary in particular. Not that she's not involved with contemporary sculpture, obviously, or sculptural objects, but I thought that the statue itself, especially if they're named, you know, Alexander the Great, then you have to begin to question, you know, the history of heroic statuary or whatever.
So, having written that many years ago, and then looking at this show now, the idea of the statue and was interesting, but not as interesting as other things. And if I can sort of jog you a little bit into that, tell me if I've got this right or not, but I think I agree with you here. Conversations around Rachel Harrison's sculpture tend to put the writer in the position of sort of making a catalog of the sort of ready-made, repurposed, consumer-oriented things that come together in a Rachel Harrison piece. And then
and their connotations and their references within popular culture or mass culture, right?
And the trope, and it's not untrue, is that they maybe don't add up, or they add up to one story, and then you can immediately switch channels. Sorry.
Could you speak up or speak into the microphone a little bit?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Anyway, you can take these ready-made pieces, these in her work, and sort of make a story up, make a narrative up, or you know, then switch channels and make another story up, and it doesn't sort of settle down into one thing. But I think your point is that people get sort of stuck in making these lists about consumer products that wander into her sculptures.
I'm calling it the pathology of enumeration.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like whatever, you go through and you detail every, you know, Slim Fast can and every kind of prop apple with a bite bitten out of it, and you kind of miss the obvious elephant in the room, is this heavily articulated sculpture that I think we're stuck, unfortunately, with the word blob, which I don't really like, in reference to the sculptural objects that provide whatever, the excuse for those things to be collected, right? So I was thinking if there's some way, we know, and I think writers have talked about this, reviewers have talked about this, like a kind of relationship between the sculptural base and the sculptural object. You can do statues again here with the, you know, the base is different than the statue, but I think that there is a kind of play once you see, you know, a number of years of Rachel's work where things step forward and then things step back. Like you and I were looking at the Warren Beatty sculpture in the next room, which are like moving blankets surrounding what's apparently a wooden and maybe polystyrene armature. And it doesn't have another object sitting on top of it. And so this is part of the, I wouldn't call it a game necessarily, but this is part of the language that Rachel uses, that things can step forward and things can step back in these conversations between sculptural object and base, between what's a shelf and what's a what's a pedestal and what's a kind of, maybe the pedestal has become too ornate and has to become the sculpture itself or something. But if we're stuck with ideas like I think not very particularly, telling characterizations such as blob and boulder and other kind of words that I think most of the reviewers usually use in talking about Rachel's work, that we miss a huge second discourse, if you will, or a second read, right? That the first read is huge, sometimes multicolored object. Second read is, this kind of, I think, Joanna Burton calls it, Rachel pushing references into orbit, which is, they might not, I think Darby English ends up saying in the catalog that these things are never concluded. You go from title to object and you kind of play this game of association. Some things add up pleasantly, some things pleasantly are left open-ended, right? But then usually that's accompanied by a description of the sculptural object as a blob with garish camouflage, which is really giving short shrift to what I think is the basis of the work, right? This continued investigation of what it is to be base, to be sculpture, to be, so there are two reads, right? The orbiting commodity read, which can be satirical and lighthearted, etc. And then I think, a lot of times that the sculptures themselves and their articulations are of an order that's serious, like a kind of serious investigation of what it is to be a polychromed, object in whatever, a contemporary art milieu,
So I think your point is that it's more than it's, as you say, it's a second read, though I would even wonder whether it's a first read, that we so easily reduce these things to
language.
To the image that we can describe, as you said, in words because we recognize something, some bit of technology or some celebrity's photograph, and we can begin to muse on that and stop there. And what we have a hard time with is coming to terms with her surfaces, where she makes these, let's call them now, just for the time being, these sort of large. I mean, to use the word blob is just kind of not right in a way. As you point out, these sculptures have a very wide range of reference of things that she's looking at, both in their color and in their form.
Right.
And she has, disguised these references, I think, or what she's thinking about, and she never is very literal about them anyway. But as we were walking around, we talked about the sculptors that we talked about. We talked about Anne Truitt, we talked about Rodin, we talked about Man Ray, we've talked about the surrealist mannequins. I mean, we've covered a wide range. And then if you add on to that a discussion of the color and where the color's coming from, that there's a lot to talk about there, and a lot that she has left for us to discover, I think.
That can't just be categorized as garish camouflage, which I think is one combination of adjectives that's been used in a review or something. I guess I can only talk about the way that I view the work, which is probably, I don't know, maybe eccentric, but also as an artist myself who identifies largely with a number of elements of the practice, right? That there's an initial like, oh, this thing, you know, a kind of draws you in, kind of desire, and I think that's usually practically the sculptural object that draws you in. And then you get involved in this kind of, you know, array of references that are or are not adding up. And then I continue viewing after that. And I begin looking at specifically the fact that the sculptural object itself is the most, I wouldn't say labor intensive, but the most hand articulated and oftentimes on a quite, you know, out of human scale, both in its surface texture as well as in its increasingly, I think, over time, its paint application. So that when I read whatever garish camouflage or you know, impressionistic, I end up thinking, well, what do you do with colors that are Sonia Delaunay and Robert Delaunay? Are those now garish? You know, isn't she like kind of pulling from this rich history of, if not polychrome sculpture, then at least painting? And they are not obvious references. I mean, with the, what's the one called with the, I think it's from the Help show, with the one that I think the painting application is somewhat inspired by Matisse's Woman with a Hat.
Oh, right, yeah.
Right. It's in the next room, you'll see it's the first thing there. I know that whether intuitively or in real life, that Rachel is inspired by this work, and I think it's a kind of complexity that most that viewers get, that somehow writers might not be able to account for because it's outside of language. It's a kind of, you know, I would even say more intuitive aspect, or the love of articulating surfaces is what, you know, an artist like me gets. And I mean, the surface themselves, which I've never seen anybody talk about, is I mean, you can think of Rodin working in plaster to some extent, but the thing that I went with when looking at the surfaces when they're painted is there are a couple of Edward Hoppers. Is it upstairs or downstairs? Upstairs.
Upstairs, yep.
There's the one with the clown. Like, go upstairs and look at that one. You'll notice that the canvas that it's painted on, like, has a kind of deep tooth to it. You know, it's not burlap, but it's like, you know, has a kind of open weave and a kind of deep, what we say, tooth. And then you go over and look at I forget what the red brick storefronts. It's kind of a long horizontal panel to your right. The one that I'm talking about is like with the bigger tooth.
I think it's called Saturday Night.
With the clown in it, right?
Yeah.
And then the one with the red brick storefronts is on something that's kind of as fine as linen. And watch the different ways that the paint application has to change according to the material that it's painted on. So that one of the things that painters like about something with a tooth to it is that it has a kind of, in the case of Hopper, like it will drag the materiality of the paint off the brush, so that you have like a much more kind of, I wouldn't say loose, but there's a reaction between you're not just coloring a surface, you're using it materially to drag the paint off of a brush. And so, if we want to call that facture, right? Some, you know, facture being on the spectrum, some things are more facture than other things, right? That she's created a surface that's 100% facture, not with this one, but with most of these, including Al Gore, right? that it's not stucco, it's not a reference, it's a kind of material concern that she wants the most variegated surface that she can get in order to begin applying pigment to. I think there's another one in the other room. I was trying to remember with Jeffrey what this one was called. It's kind of dull green one. Sorry, we sound so stupid not knowing.
Cindy? Are you talking about Cindy?
No, Cindy's on the right, but then straightforward is a kind of is a dull green monochrome one. That if you'll go, what's it called? Untitled.
Oh, thank you.
Oh yeah, that I was
easy.
gonna say that. You'll notice that that's an earlier one, and it certainly has a mottled surface, but it's not as what is it, like hand articulated, or there's not as much facture in that surface, and it seems like something that Rachel over time has gone towards, maybe, is this idea of, I can't say Rachel's not here, she might hate it, right? That those are material concerns from an artistic perspective, and that's actually where I end up with the work and the kind of arrangement of commodity and consumer references becomes less important to me because I get involved in whatever the color and the texture thing. So.
Well, that certainly is to read Rachel Harrison against the grain of the way she's usually read, is to sort of move quickly over those ideas. So yeah, intentionally so, which I think is good. You know, this is a kind of loony question, but it seems to me Al Gore is a good example here of something that I just noticed when this sculpture came in. Al Gore, if you go up close to it, has a...
you can't.
You can't go, I mean, obviously we can't go up close, and that's the point, but you can see it.
On
the side, there is a thermostat, and this is kind of a joke about Al Gore and climate change and so on. When I saw that thermostat in the profile of Al Gore when it came into the gallery, I looked at it and it looked to me like Al Gore had a tumor, and that piece of technology sticking out of it was a very evil growth of some sort. And so it really made me wonder whether some of these so-called technological things that are embedded in some of these sculptures, whether they have a biological reading, you know, which is a funny thing.
Maybe not necessarily a tumor, but certainly if you're going to have sculptural objects that take as their inspiration figurative statuary, then of course it's going to have a relationship to the body. I think again that's one of the languages that Rachel induces is like, you know, you could call the putting masks on things. You're always kind of, not always, I mean, I think that Rachel will make a sculpture and then she might make the kind of opposite of that sculpture. Like we're saying, if some sculptures have like 7, you know, products on them or something, then Warren Beatty now can have no products at all. It's kind of call and response in the studio that happens over time. And I, as an artist, like I identify with that practice of what is it? Arguing with myself about what the expectations that people might have with the work, right?
Well, something that your work shares with hers is this kind of picking up of the kind of celebrity or the semi-celebrity or the once celebrity of the subculture and sticking that image into the complex of a new work and a new meaning. So with that in mind, I'm wondering, I'd be very curious, and we didn't talk about this before, is what do you think of Amy Winehouse, the suite of Amy Winehouse drawings?
I like Amy
I'd love to hear
Winehouse.
what you said about that.
I like Amy Winehouse. Yeah, certainly. Well, I mean, we're not unlike previous, millennia, previous centuries, that we don't have a common language of religious subject matter and classical reference. So that I think for certainly we people after pop, I don't know, Marston Hartley is still using, right, religious subject matter. That celebrity becomes our kind of common myth or something. I don't want to, put it on a pedestal necessarily, but it becomes the kind of, well, we know that this is about a kind of tragedy, but also kind of like the condition of a woman working in an industry that might want to exclude her rather than accept her, or take advantage of her dysfunction in order to monetize it, right? So that they become allegories that we can, like, because we don't have Janis and, well, Janis Joplin, but who I'm not gonna say Oedipus, but we don't have Greek and myth the way that Freud was able to pull from them, because we no longer have, most of us no longer have that common language that one would have had in, say, 18th, 19th century. You can look, I don't know, I was looking at Boucher the other day, everything's either a kind of, there are some religious pictures, right? But mostly they're whatever cavalier, whimsical paintings of people that are just happen to be called Eros or Cupid, right? That was a common language, that it brought with it allegories and stories that we don't necessarily have, like we have about whatever, Justin Bieber in my case, or more recently Nick Jonas, or Amy Winehouse.
Yeah, say something about Amy Winehouse. Why do you
I
think?
really don't know. That's Rachel's territory.
Oh, you don't have any speculations about why Amy Winehouse or how Amy Winehouse?
Sounds like you know something.
No, I mean, I really don't think we ever, in the process of working on this, directly asked her that question about Amy Winehouse, but I'm still
stuck in Cold Wave. I'm just still echoing the Muddy Men, whatever. I don't do. I don't even listen to Nick Jonas and Justin Bieber. It's just shirtless pictures.
The power of that room of Amy Winehouse, and any time I've seen Amy Winehouse, is extraordinary, though. And
its plum-colored grayish wall.
Yeah, that's a brilliant touch. But even without the plum-colored, I can tell you they pack a wallop. So it's hard to sort of bring that into a discussion that we were having about the sculpture, but really some of the same things, the fact, the color, the touch, the wide range of reference that we were talking about in the sculpture. It's all in those drawings too.
Right.
What I like to see in those drawings, and though what makes me really happy about them, and something we didn't talk about either, is their kind of wildness, wildness and their
looseness, you mean?
I mean that it's that somehow Rachel has found a way to kind of just lose. It's a very controlled loss of control in the drawings that sort of echoes the subject, and it just works. But then when you come into various pieces of sculpture, like I'm looking at one now with the life on Mars, you see this kind of ability to go just kind of wild in a piece like that. That makes me think of Amy Winehouse. And everything that you're saying about the body of this sculpture is true and should be addressed because it's the most eccentric polymorphous form, really, and color is extraordinary in that.
Well,
and you were talking about when we were walking by before, I won't take your words away, about the way that it's half done in a way, that sculpture.
I think most people would call the paint job, half finished. But knowing the rest of the work, I think, because I have seen, strangely, a lot of Rachel's work over the years, that given the completeness of the polychrome of the rest of the things, this is in direct response where she reveals the raw surface to those who would have questioned what's underneath the polychrome. Mm-hmm. Or what's underneath the monochromatic paint
mm-hmm,
job.
Mm-hmm,
so mm-hmm. It's not unfinished. It's obviously in the gallery, but consequently she lets you in to either be absorbed by or not absorbed by the raw surface that's underneath every other painted object, right? So. It's a kind of reveal, but I think in a kind of, in conversation with the rest of her work. And I think that you can certainly isolate pieces out. But to me, like looking at them, the wig is a reoccurrence of Cindy, for example. Mm-hmm. Or there are other, plywood that we could pick up in other things. Mm-hmm. That the intentional reoccurrence of things are in conversation with each other over the decades of work, I think. She's still trying to kind of build upon, yet take away from what had preceded it or something, So something called Untitled would be a response to the rest of them having titles like Alexander the Great, right? So.
But you have to say something about the wig, or maybe you don't want to, because it's really the wig that you could argue is the terrifying.
Wigs.
A big black wig like that is.
I think it's multiple wigs. You've never worn a wig?
I never thought of that.
Let me tell. I think it's multiple wigs. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, further to the what is it? It wouldn't be verisimilitude, but its relationship to the figurative sculpture. Put a wig on top, all of a sudden it becomes figurative. The interest lies in what you have to add to it to make it something completely different, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the pieces of vocabulary in this language that Rachel's developed over the years, right? I mean, one final thing about the quote-unquote blobs is that I began to think of them more as kind of, I don't know, you and I bandied the word organ about, and it does, maybe have that relationship to the body, but I don't know. I mean, we have a history of sculpture about the body that I'm not sure I want to get involved with. That I began viewing them as whatever organs in a more kind of, hopefully, more loose and elaborate sense. The organ being, of course, the thing that Artaud wished that he didn't have, if you know Deleuze. But also as, and this might be the point, that for, at least from my appreciation of Rachel, I imagine the organs, if we want to call them that now, as kind of generative machines that are the excuse to make the work happen. And within that generative organ or forms of course, play, but also of permission and prohibition, and the things that are the conversation with the artists themselves in the studio. Because I assume that largely with the ones that do have these more organic things in them, that it starts as whatever the armature, and then there's a conversation that starts with Rachel and herself about what's high enough, what's fat enough, what's what's wide enough, what's precarious enough, right? So those are all different kinds of decisions. I've made too many tall ones, so now I have to make the short, fat one. Next stage is the external articulation of the thing, like covering the entire thing with concrete, when sometimes it's not entirely covered with concrete because that's part of the conversation of the artists themselves. We're still dealing with the organ that all things spring from in the work, right? And that's whatever we got, this is at some point, we got things in the studio, this gets drawn from the pile of electronic parts, and this video is downloaded from Hoarders, and those things get put on until they get taken off, and I'm sorry, I'm whatever, drawing this out too long, but I think it's a conversation with Rachel within herself that's kind of generated, the word again, started by this engine that those organs are. Right?
I really love that idea. That this is that these are, let's call them organs for the hell of it, but that this is where it does start, I think, and that they speak to her. I agree.
And end, I think.
And end.
Because that's where what I end up spending most of my time as somebody who might, be more than engaged, might actually identify with that process. That becomes the thing that I spend the most time with is whatever.
Another thing we talked about that you and Rachel share is a kind of wide range of interests in, let's call it, the history of art, and that maybe that's something that drew you together, and it wasn't necessarily just the sort of contemporary people who came just before you, although I think you share interests in some of those people. We talked about Mike Kelly a lot.
Right.
But that it's, with both of you, very esoteric, wide range of interests that you will allow yourselves to go wherever you feel like you want to go. And Rachel, for instance, in this new set of drawings is really looking at drawings of, of photographs and books of classical sculpture. But I mean, her range is very, very broad and quite encyclopedic, and it's very, and it's full of her desire. It's just motivated by what she's interested in.
This looks good, this doesn't look, I mean, I think those are the kind of decisions that are made, not to make them sound dumb, but I think they're really important to whatever this conversation is that Rachel's having with herself, that is the engine that produces the work, right? I had a thought there.
Well, you share that with her.
Yeah. That if I do have dissatisfactions about contemporaneity, is that it sometimes doesn't draw enough, like from the past, or isn't, because I guess I don't have whatever a super academic art historical grounding, but I have areas of dense interest, which is desire, right? What can I steal from Rodin, for example, today, right? And I think whether Rachel plays those games or not, I think she has a wide range of desire-driven knowledge, right? Not that you want to, pick up, not that you want to make explicit Warren Beatty's relationship to Man Ray's The Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, but it's it's there in its wool blanket wrapped aspect, right? So those things are not explicit, and they're more difficult for writers or reviewers to be able to talk about because you really can't pin them down, and they might occur like in a more kind of what's the word? I'm not echolocate. They might be sending messages to the confraternity of people that are as densely interested in these things as, because that's what happened with, me looking at the sculpture and wanting them to be about, because I was following Anatolian sculpture at that moment or something. And it just seemed obvious that, here's Rachel's picking up on this. I know that she knows this somehow. I know that Rachel's not ignorant of these things, that she's like building them into for that 1% of the viewing audience that's going to spend the time to whatever, is so kind of captivated, and I think that's a good word to use when you approach Rachel's work, captivated enough to let this wide array of things that aren't just the commodities that are placed, not to treat those derogatorily, but this kind of wider range of references, not even references, wider range of desires that I think that Rachel is quite intrigued by.
I think she has this rare ability to sort of just allow herself to. One of my favorite things in this exhibition is a series of, I don't know how many, 5 or 6 photographs of, they look like black circles. They look like black circles in a square format, and you really don't know what they are, and the title helps you a little bit. It's called Springs. And have you seen those? Yeah, and I love these works. Actually, Springs is the place where Jackson Pollock's studio is, and those are
the place is called Springs.
The place is called Springs. It's in Long Island, and those photographs are looking down into the cans of paint in Jackson Pollock's studio that's been preserved with the paint cans open, supposedly, and the paint brushes stuck in them.
So are Lee Krasner's boots in the same vicinity?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
And in the original Green Neftali show, the photographs of the cans of paint were right next to the sculpture that had the photograph of Lee Krasner's
So she's looking down on Pollock.
She's looking down on Pollock, you could say, yes, for sure.
And Krasner's feet.
And Krasner's feet.
I don't think that's, I think that would be something that Rachel would build into the work that's not necessarily the most obvious connotation, right?
When the two pieces of work are hanging in proximity, which they aren't here, but
in conversation with each other.
Yeah. But it's too bad, because every time that series of photographs is discussed, it's always discussed in sort of the formal terms of what does it mean to take a photograph, as she has done with her cell phone, and what are the vagaries of cell phone photography that she allows to happen in the image, the reflections and stuff like that, all of which she allows into her kind of use of photography. And people talk about that, but they don't talk about looking down, as you say, on Pollock's hands, or
condescendingly,
or
in the position that Pollock used to make his work, looking down.
Yeah, these kinds of things. But Rachel would go to all those meanings.
I think so too. I think
things.
I totally have faith that she is control of every connotation of those things, to the extent that she's wiping out some connotations that viewers might want to get to from her work.
Yeah. Let's talk about politics for a minute, because
he went to the hospital day before yesterday.
Anyway.
That's right, it was a Trump reference.
Oh, that's right, he did.
Morning Joe says he's probably weighing up to 300 pounds.
Oh, they're lying then because the paper said he was just like 3 pounds short of obesity.
Who's lying? Up is down, down is up.
Let's talk about politics in this work, or let's do that. You were telling me in the Matt Dillon interview with Rachel in Interview magazine, which I haven't read.
Right.
He asks her something about being a feminist artist, a
No,
woman.
would you call yourself a woman artist?
And she says,
She doesn't answer the question.
she just leaves it
She
completely.
changes the topic, I think.
Completely.
Yeah, politics are, let's see. I mean, one thing that I was thinking about when I was writing this is that, I mean, Rachel and I literally started our careers at the same time. You know, me in LA, she here. And whatever, had some she had a short relationship with Feature Gallery. I showed there for a long time. That certainly once you get to this age, that you realize that discourses appear into the art world and seem like truth at the time, and then they kind of recede because another truth has arrived or something. And so for me, and what was like both kind of devastating as well as highly instructional was 91 was kind of AIDS activist era. And what am I doing? Trying to be gay and having a certainly a personal interest and certainly personal politics that had to do with healthcare and everything else like that. But I just couldn't bring myself to, arriving at a place where I could do, bus bench ads about safe sex, right? I think that I know that I have, and I'm kind of intuiting that Rachel has, always looking, as these discourses come, whatever pass, painting's dead, painting's not dead, painting's a zombie, painting's a blah, 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 as these discourses come into favor, there's always a kind of looking for a little place in there that maybe that largely kind of assumes that you should get on board, but we're always looking at whatever it is, our 8-year-old self who wanted to be, a painter, looking for that little thing that you hold on to in the midst of this, what can be oppressive? You and I were using the term evangelical. What can be the kind of evangelism of discourses as they, come in and out, right? That having been whatever, both damaged and nurtured in the Bible Belt, I really have a kind of hyper-vigilance to any discourse that sounds to the least bit like it has the answer to everything. And I don't know Rachel's past or anything necessarily like that, but I assume that that personal life may be completely different, but there's never a kind of jumping on board to the, say, simulacrum. If you remember when this was the go-to term for what you were doing. Or when I first looked at I had the gallery send me a collection of reviews and essays up until whatever date that we decided that Parquet was. And it was one of the first PDFs, I think, that I might have had. So I did a search. I'm like, who could search a PDF? There were 300 mentions of Chaim Steinbach in relationship to Rachel's work. So this would become a common go to reference if you're going to talk about the evil of corporations or
commodity culture.
or a kind of new de Boer, new society of spectacle kind of that within that she's sort of she's knowing that this discourse exists, but she's never going into its almost kind of really conclusive or revelatory I would say redemption when it comes to Christianity, but that this kind of like, we've arrived at a truth that reveals the art world and the art object's position within culture, the simulacrum, Not that that's whatever old hat or something, but the fact that she's operating differently within that as that becomes, as that is the major thrust of contemporary discourse is, I think, to her credit, that she's still looking for something different within that kind of way of explaining the universe, And discourses come and go. There are there are truths that are present at the time that might not live the test of time and might not be able to be applied to an artist's own desire for their own practice, right?
I think the fact that we're sitting on these chairs, which is obviously Rachel's idea surrounding this sculpture, and that she's arranged these chairs for us or the public to sit in. She's in the space in the middle with the black floor. She's drawn the lines of the polis of the village of whatever. It's a social space that she has made for us in her kind of seemingly jokey. Yeah, this is definitely our backs to the. But nonetheless, she has never forgotten us. And so the fact that it's without direct one line evangelical, if you want to call it that, message, is nonetheless completely undercut by this idea that the viewer, in this work, we are moving through a space that's a social space in this exhibition, and it's done lightly. I mean, you don't kind of realize that you, the spectator, are a part of this.
Yeah, it's not that idea of immersive. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I just always get that with students.
I know. No,
it's immersive because you can walk into it. I'm like, haven't you ever stood in front of a painting and had an experience? That's immersion. You don't physically have to enter that. Sorry.
No, but you see my point, that it's a very she hasn't left her public. It's behind
for
at
me
all.
As a viewer, I think they're incredibly generous.
Mm-hmm.
I know that she's having a little antagonism with me in some of them, like kind of defying my presumptions, right? But in the end, whether it's through reference or whether it's through materiality, that I end up being kind of enriched by viewing of the work, which is I don't know, for me, something I don't see that much of.
No. The first room, and then we'll open up for questions. The first room of the show is about the 90s. This is early work that she had saved and the gallery had saved and so on. And she really kept working on us. She wanted it to look like a 90s installation space.
Oh, yeah.
And so, it has a different quality. Things are on pedestals, they're hanging on the walls. It's kind of, this is a gallery, actually, the 90s. But
Right.
then it changes, really. And
Is it the recreation of one installation?
there's the recreation. I mean, it was never, I guess it was an installation. It was a room in an apartment that was
I think the tagline to the catalog.
Yeah, it's repurposed as Rachel reimagined it, and then the apartment in all of its absolute dimensions is brought into the gallery space, which is kind of brilliant too, because this is the scale that her work was shown in, that was first discovered in, was like this little tiny space, not this kind of amazing Renzo piano place. Yeah. Anyway, we're getting, do we have time for questions? Okay, so we're ready. There's one.
The photographic work seems to me to allude to really conceptual photography of like the West Coast in the 60s, 70s, like not very known now, but I've forgotten his name, Lou so-and-so, who did these kinds of photographs in black and white of water in a sink dripping, like 10 images, and then you'd have this kind of, no, her work alludes to this kind of work, it seems to me. In the other room, this whole photographic series that has like almost dematerialize your scene like step by step, where it's like breaking down, very like in this this old-fashioned grid-like conceptual way. Sure. And what I wanted to ask you about is how those to me almost seem like jarringly different in a certain sense, to even though the coloring is similar, but the conceptual principle that's going on in it is in some regards a kind of jarring contrast, and it brought up this issue of time to me in a very clear way. And I wondered if you could go further into this, you did touch on it earlier, into this issue of how she's working with time in a lot of the arrangements here and sculptural works.
Pre-digital. I think that's important to note. Is she kind of photoshopping before this is Photoshop. Correct me if I'm wrong, that's like one snapshot that she's rephotographed a number of different times, each having its own kind of quality, that somehow has something to do with light, I think. It's an investigation. You can maybe speak more to that than I can. You being Elisabeth.
You feel that it's so different. You said maybe the color unites them, but that looks kind of like old-fashioned conceptualism. Is that what you're trying to say? Yeah. Yeah.
I think that it's really stepping quite a ways away from conceptual work, and it's post-conceptual really. And then we have, in a way, with the photographs, quite a throwback, it seems to me, to certain principles that you just don't see very much now. Not the found, the celebrities, not the found imagery of like couples, or that stuff's a bit different sensibility. But anyway.
I've looked at those. I think those are really interesting, but I don't know if I can draw a connection. It's harder for me to read, a precedent or a nuance of reference in those that I can read in other things. But I think you're right that she may be, whatever, mockingly commenting upon the kind of seriality that may or may not have been in vogue at one point. But I think it's also a serious investigation of how do you alter that's the same thing through the same machine? You got a camera, you got a snapshot. How many different ways can it look? It just reminds me of, I don't know, Douglas Hubler is not who you're talking about, is it? But Doug's amazing, I don't know how many of these, Doug's amazing project to photograph every person in the world was an amazing Doug Hubler. He only got one photograph out of it, but the attempt is the impossibility of the attempt is full of that kind of satire of a very kind of serious-minded We could say, I mean, structuralists can be incredibly humorous as well, but yeah, there may be something in there about seriality that I'm not like able to articulate at the moment. Yeah.
I think they're installed, you know, they look very formal. I mean, it is a very long series. It looks like seriality. I would say what's kind of really distinguishing about Rachel as, let's say, a photographer, at that point and throughout, is how many different aspects of the medium she just goes to simultaneously without any trouble at all. From straight on documentary type photography that you see in the early drawings, and even in some of the sculpture of garbage bags on the street, people walking on the street, documentary, you know, it's like I'm just shooting people as in the city, you know, that kind of thing. Same
and
time
using the whole contact sheet.
Yeah.
It's the truth of photography, right?
Sometimes she does that. Sometimes she goes and appropriates some celebrity photograph out of a bin somewhere simultaneously.
Are we allowed to talk about the bullet hole?
Excuse me. Oh.
Are we allowed to talk about the bullet hole?
Oh, sure.
Sorry, different topic, but yeah.
It's it is a photograph.
There's a bullet hole in the show, so I'll let you people find it.
But it's in a photograph. It's through a photograph of a person, so that it's...
That Rachel didn't shoot herself.
Anyway, she's quite bold in that way. You know, you're not going to peg me. I'm not pictures generation. I'm not going to do something that you're going to recognize as a Rachel Harrison photograph. There are all kinds of things I can do with photography and cameras. And I'm not even a photographer. I mean, Rachel tells this great story about being asked to teach photography in the Columbia MA art program. She didn't know what to do with a dark room. She didn't know how to really tell these students how to take a photograph. She got somebody who was a wonderful, talented photographer to work with her and the students to do it. But she sure knew photography. You know, it's all through the work, this kind of boldness about doing photography.
Cheers. Thanks.
Yeah.